Most people approach the rent versus buy debate the same way. They ask which one is better, renting or buying, as if one of them is right and the other is wrong, as if the answer were permanent. But that's the first mistake, because renting and buying are not opposing beliefs. They're not moral choices, and they're definitely not lifelong identities. They're tools, and like any tool, their value depends entirely on when you use them. The internet is full of comparisons: rent money versus mortgage payments, equity versus throwing money away, appreciation charts and tax benefits, but almost all of them miss the most important variable in the equation: timing. The same decision can be smart at one point in life and destructive at another. Renting at 25 is not the same as renting at 45. Buying at 30 is not the same as buying at 50. Yet we talk about these decisions as if context doesn't matter, as if life were static, as if income never changes, as if priorities stay the same for 30 years. They don't. And that's why so many people feel confused. They follow advice that worked for someone else in a different phase under different conditions. This video isn't about declaring a winner. It's not about saying renting is good and buying is bad or the other way around. It's about something much quieter and much more important: the timing nobody talks about. Because most people don't lose money because they chose the wrong option. They lose it because they chose too early. Once you look at timing, the old question starts to fall apart. Should I rent or should I buy sounds reasonable. But structurally, it's the wrong frame, because it assumes that the decision itself is what creates security. It doesn't. What actually matters is what the decision does to your margin. Let's look at how people usually compare the two. They compare rent to a mortgage payment, monthly numbers side by side. Rent is $2,000. The mortgage is $2,200. So buying must be better. But that comparison ignores almost everything that matters. Rent is a ceiling. Your maximum cost is known. A mortgage is a floor. Taxes rise. Insurance rises. Maintenance shows up whether you're ready or not. And more importantly, a mortgage converts flexibility into obligation. Rent doesn't. That's why this debate feels so emotional. Buying feels like progress. Renting feels like delay, but those feelings are psychological, not financial. The real question isn't which option builds wealth faster. It's which option preserves optionality at this stage of your life. Because optionality is what turns income into leverage. If your income drops by 20%, rent adjusts eventually. A mortgage doesn't. If an opportunity shows up in another city, rent lets you move. A mortgage asks you to sell rent out or absorb friction. Neither option is inherently superior. They simply solve different problems. Renting buys you time. Buying locks in stability. The mistake happens when people buy stability before their life has stabilized. They optimize for ownership before they've built resilience. That's why so many people say, I did everything right, but I still feel stuck. They didn't make a bad decision. They made a premature one. And that's the distinction most advice never makes. Renting isn't wasting money if it's buying you flexibility. Buying isn't building wealth if it's shrinking your margin. Once you see that, the question changes. Not should I rent or buy, but which one supports the version of my life I'm actually living right now. And that's the frame we'll use going forward. One of the most persistent myths in personal finance is that renting means you're losing money. That belief sounds logical on the surface. You pay every month. You don't build equity. Nothing feels permanent. But financially, that frame is incomplete, because money isn't the only resource you're spending. Time, flexibility, and margin matter just as much. There are specific stages of life where renting isn't a compromise, it's a strategic advantage. The first is income instability. If a meaningful portion of your income comes from bonuses, commissions, variable hours, or an industry that moves in cycles, your cash flow is not as predictable as it looks on paper. Banks still lend based on current numbers. Life doesn't. In that phase, fixed obligations amplify risk. Rent limits it. The second is life optionality. If your career path is still evolving, if you might change industries, move cities, or experiment with a new opportunity, ownership adds friction right when you need mobility. Rent keeps decisions reversible. Mortgages don't. The third is margin. Let's look at simple math. Assume after-tax income of $5,500 a month. Rent cost $1,800. Buying a comparable home would mean a mortgage, property tax, and insurance totaling about $2,600. That's an $800 difference every month. Over a year, that's nearly $10,000. But the real value isn't the number itself. It's what that gap creates. $800 a month is a buffer. It absorbs mistakes. It absorbs surprises. It turns emergencies into inconveniences. It also creates choices. You can invest during downturns. You can pause without panic. You can say no to bad opportunities because you're not cornered by fixed costs. This is the part most people miss. Renting doesn't waste money when it's buying you optionality. Buying too early doesn't build wealth when it consumes your margin. Security isn't about owning something. It's about how many mistakes you can survive. In early or unstable phases of life, renting increases that capacity. And that's why for many people, renting isn't falling behind. It's holding space until their life system is stable enough to benefit from ownership instead of being constrained by it. Once you see renting as a tool, not a failure, the decision becomes clearer. Not emotionally, structurally. Renting is powerful, but it isn't universally optimal. Just like buying too early can trap you, renting too long can quietly erode your position. The shift doesn't happen emotionally. It happens structurally. Renting starts to become inefficient when the conditions that once made it valuable no longer apply. The first condition is income stability. If your income has been steady for several years, not driven by bonuses, commissions, or volatile cycles, the risk profile of fixed housing costs changes. Predictability reduces fragility. The second condition is life direction. If your career path has narrowed, your location is unlikely to change, and your priorities have shifted from exploration to consolidation, flexibility loses some of its marginal value. You're no longer paying for optionality you actively use. You're paying for optionality you rarely exercise. The third condition is cost equivalence. Let's look at simple math again. Assume rent is $2,400 a month. Now compare that to a modest, sustainable ownership option. A smaller home, a conservative mortgage, taxes and insurance included. Total monthly cost roughly $2,100. At that point, the numbers change meaningfully. The gap that once created margin disappears. Rent no longer buys you flexibility. It simply becomes a premium for liquidity you're not using. And here's the subtle cost most people ignore. Rent increases over time. Mortgages don't. Your payment stays fixed. Your income ideally grows. That spread over years becomes equity, stability, and leverage. Not because houses magically make people rich, but because the structure starts working in your favor. This is the inflection point. When renting no longer reduces risk and buying no longer increases fragility. At that moment, renting stops being strategic. It becomes inefficient, and this is the insight worth remembering. Renting is powerful when flexibility matters, but when your life no longer requires constant maneuverability, continuing to rent means paying for a feature you're no longer using. The decision hasn't become moral, it's become mathematical. And that's when the question shifts from, should I keep my options open, to what structure best supports the life I'm already living? At this point, the question is no longer, is renting good or bad, or is buying smart or risky? The real question becomes timing. Buying a home is not about age. It's not about milestones. And it's definitely not about doing what everyone else is doing. It's about whether your personal system is stable enough to absorb a fixed commitment without losing flexibility. There are 3 conditions that need to exist at the same time. Not one, not two, all 3. The first is income stability, not high income. Stable income. Ideally, you've had consistent earnings for at least 3 to 5 years. Your cash flow doesn't rely heavily on bonuses, commissions, or cyclical spikes. You can reasonably predict what next year looks like and the year after that. Stability reduces the risk that fixed costs become pressure. The second condition is cost discipline. Housing costs, mortgage taxes, insurance, maintenance should stay within roughly 25 to 30% of your real after-tax income. Not what the bank approves, not what looks impressive on paper. This is the critical difference. Banks optimize repayment. You must optimize margin. Margin is what allows you to absorb mistakes, pauses, and surprises without your entire life tightening around a payment. The third condition is life direction. At this stage, your need for constant pivoting has decreased. You're not planning major career shifts. You're not chasing geographic flexibility. You're prioritizing depth over exploration. This doesn't mean ambition disappears. It means your ambition no longer requires constant movement. When these three conditions align, buying a home stops being a constraint. It becomes a stabilizer. And this is where most people get the comparison wrong. Many people buy because everyone else is buying, because rent feels like wasted money, because ownership feels like progress. But those are emotional reasons. The smarter comparison is this: are you buying to create stability, or are you buying because stability already exists? If you buy to create stability, the house has to do too much work. If you buy once stability is already present, the house simply supports what's already working. That's the distinction. You don't buy a home when you want stability. You buy when stability no longer costs you flexibility. And that's the moment when ownership stops being a risk and starts becoming a rational structural decision. The biggest misunderstanding about buying early is thinking it's neutral, that if it doesn't help, at least it doesn't hurt. That assumption is wrong. Buying too early has a cost, but it's not the one most people look at. The real cost is structural. When you buy a home early, your fixed costs rise before your system is ready. Mortgage payments lock in. Taxes don't adjust downward. Insurance, maintenance, utilities, they all arrive immediately. Your income, meanwhile, is still evolving. This timing mismatch is where the damage starts. Because when fixed costs rise early, margin disappears early. And margin is what allows mistakes to be survivable. Without margin, every future decision becomes defensive. Not because you suddenly became risk-averse. Not because your personality changed, but because your structure did. Compare the internal dialogue. The renter thinks, I can try this, I can take a short-term hit, I can move if this doesn't work. The early buyer thinks, I can't afford to mess this up. I need stability now. I'll wait. Both people may be equally intelligent, equally disciplined, equally ambitious. The difference isn't character, it's obligation. Early ownership doesn't just add responsibility, it narrows time horizons. Career moves feel riskier. Side projects feel indulgent. Temporary income drops feel catastrophic. Nothing dramatic happens all at once. There's no explosion, no obvious failure, just a slow compression. Optionality shrinks, flexibility erodes, and decisions that could have compounded growth get delayed or avoided entirely. This is why buying early often feels responsible but produces fragile outcomes. You didn't make a reckless choice, you made a rational one inside the wrong timeline. Buying too early doesn't ruin people. It quietly turns growth into maintenance before growth ever had a chance. And that's the cost most people don't see until years later when they realize they didn't fail. They just locked the system too soon. At this point, the mistake would be turning this into a rule. Rent is not good. Buy is not bad. And buying is not winning the same way renting is not falling behind. They are tools. Each one does a different job at a different moment in life. Renting buys you time. It buys you flexibility. It keeps your system light. It lets your income stabilize. It lets your identity shift. It lets you test paths without committing to one too early. Buying does something else. It locks costs. It trades flexibility for predictability. It converts uncertainty into structure. Neither is superior on its own. The only mistake is using the wrong tool for the phase you're in. The right question is not, which one is better financially? That question assumes life is static. The real question is quieter and far more revealing. What do I need more right now? Time flexibility or stability. Early in life, flexibility compounds faster than ownership. Later in life, stability protects what you've built. Problems don't come from renting too long. They come from buying too early. From using a tool designed to lock things down when your life is still meant to move. Renting doesn't mean you're avoiding responsibility. Buying doesn't mean you've made it. They simply reflect what you're optimizing for. And optimization only works when it matches timing. So don't ask, is renting or buying more profitable? That question misses the point. Ask this instead. At this moment in my life, which decision opens my future and which one narrows it? Because renting and buying aren't financial choices. They're timing choices. And most people don't lose money because they chose the wrong option. They lose money because they chose too early. They locked stability before flexibility had finished compounding. They turned growth into maintenance before growth had fully played out. The right home doesn't make you feel successful. It makes your life easier under stress. It protects margin. It preserves optionality. It fits the phase you're actually in, not the one you feel pressured to reach. That's the difference between moving forward and quietly getting stuck. Not wrong decisions, just mistimed ones.